When my nephew left for the army, I felt a pang of loss. We had always been close. He was like the little brother I never had, following me around with his playful energy, full of jokes and laughter. I remember watching him run across the yard as a boy. His face lit up with excitement as he called my name. But time passed, and when he came back, the young boy I remembered had been replaced by someone else entirely. A man, confident and mature, with a seriousness in his eyes that startled me. The first time I saw him after he returned, it took me a moment to recognize him. He was standing tall, shoulders squared, with an aura of quiet strength I had never seen before. It was disarming, almost intimidating. He hugged me, but it wasn't the same carefree hug I was used to. It felt different, heavier, like he was holding on to me with more intent. I dismissed it, thinking I was just overanalyzing things. After all, he'd been through a lot. The army changes people. As days went by, I found myself observing him more closely. The way he carried himself was so different now. He seemed older, wiser. I couldn't ignore the way he looked at me either. It wasn't the look of a boy admiring his aunt. It was the look of a man who saw a woman. His eyes lingered on me longer than before, tracing over my face, my body, as though he was seeing me for the first time. It was during a family dinner one evening that I felt it most strongly. I had dressed up a bit more than usual, wearing a fitted dress that clung to my curves. I hadn't done it on purpose, or maybe I had. I couldn't even admit that to myself. His gaze flicked over to me, and when our eyes met, something unspoken passed between us. My breath hitched, and I quickly looked away, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks. I tried to focus on the conversation, but I was acutely aware of him sitting across from me. His eyes returning to me over and over. After dinner, as everyone dispersed, he stayed behind to help me clean up. We moved around the kitchen in silence, the clinking of dishes the only sound. I could feel his presence so acutely, almost as if the air was charged with electricity. At one point, he brushed past me, and his hand rested on the small of my back for just a moment too long. I froze, my heart pounding, but he didn't pull away immediately. When he did, our eyes met, and I saw something raw and unfiltered there, desire. I swallowed hard, trying to act normal. "You've changed," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He gave me a lopsided smile, one that sent a shiver down my spine. "I had to grow up fast," he replied. "But you haven't changed a bit." His words hung in the air, laden with a meaning I couldn't ignore. I laughed it off, a nervous, breathy sound that didn't match the way I was feeling inside. He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, a gesture so intimate that it left me breathless. "Stop," I whispered, but there was no conviction in my voice. "Do you really want me to?" he asked, his voice low, almost a murmur. I didn't respond. Couldn't. My head was screaming at me to step away, to put distance between us, but my body refused to move. Instead, I found myself leaning into his touch, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough for him to notice. His hand dropped to my shoulder, squeezing gently, and I felt the warmth of his palm seep into my skin. We stood there like that for a moment, the world around us falling away. It was like we were trapped in a bubble where nothing else existed, just the two of us and the electric current that buzzed between us. I could feel his breath on my cheek, and for a second I thought he was going to kiss me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I realized, with a sudden sharp clarity, that I wanted him to. He pulled back suddenly, stepping away like he'd been burned. The spell was broken, and I was left reeling, trying to catch my breath. He ran a hand through his hair, looking away from me as though he was ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tight. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," I interrupted, though my voice shook. "We just got caught up in the moment." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it. And neither did I. In the days that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every glance he threw my way felt like a touch, and I could sense the growing tension between us, like a taut wire about to snap. I found myself looking forward to seeing him, dressing up a little more, smiling a little brighter. It was intoxicating, the thrill of this forbidden attraction that simmered just beneath the surface. One night, when the rest of the family was asleep, I found him sitting alone on the back porch, the moonlight casting shadows across his face. I hesitated in the doorway, but he looked up and saw me, giving me that smile, the one that made me feel like the only woman in the world. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "No," I admitted, stepping outside. The air was cool, and I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling exposed in the thin fabric of my nightgown. He stood up, crossing the space between us in a few quick strides. "You're cold," he said, pulling off his jacket and draping it over my shoulders. "Thank you," I whispered, looking up at him. Our faces were inches apart, and I could see the conflict in his eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he fought to keep himself in check. "You know this isn't right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know," I replied, but I didn't step away. "Tell me to stop," he pleaded, his hand coming up to cradle my cheek. I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch. "I can't," and that was all it took. He pulled me against him, his mouth crashing down onto mine in a kiss that was filled with all the longing and desire we had been trying so hard to suppress. It was desperate, almost frantic, like we were both afraid this moment would slip away if we didn't hold onto it tightly enough. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, our foreheads pressed together as we tried to make sense of what we had just done. I knew we had crossed a line, one we could never uncross, but I couldn't bring myself to regret it. In that moment, all I could think about was him, not as my nephew, but as a man who made me feel more alive than I had in years. The kiss left me trembling, my body pressed against his in a way that felt both foreign and inevitable. His hands gripped my waist, almost like he was afraid I'd pull away. But the truth was, I had no intention of moving. I could feel his heartbeat, strong and frantic against my chest, and it matched the wild rhythm of my own. He pulled back slightly, just enough to look into my eyes, searching for any sign of hesitation or regret. But I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached up and brushed my fingers against his jaw, feeling the rough stubble that had grown in. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't the face of the boy I once knew. He had changed, and so had I. We weren't aunt and nephew in this moment. We were just two people caught up in something that had been building for far too long. "I shouldn't have done that," he whispered, but he didn't let go of me. His breath was hot against my lips, and I could see the turmoil in his eyes, a war between his desires and his sense of right and wrong. I swallowed hard, my throat tight with the weight of everything we weren't saying. "Maybe," I managed to reply, my voice barely more than a whisper. "But it's too late now, isn't it?" His expression softened, the conflict giving way to something softer, almost tender. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears I hadn't even realized were forming. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "I don't want to ruin what we have." "You're not," I insisted, shaking my head. "It's different now, but it doesn't have to be ruined." We stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, the night air cold against our skin but the warmth between us undeniable. He kissed me again, slower this time, as if savoring every second. I melted into him, letting myself get lost in the sensation of his lips on mine, the way his hands roamed up my back, pulling me closer. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but eventually I pulled back, gasping for air. I felt dizzy, like the ground beneath me was shifting. I stepped back, running a hand through my hair as I tried to gather my thoughts. "We can't do this," I said, though the words sounded weak even to my own ears. He looked at me, his eyes dark and intense. "Do you really believe that?" he asked. "Because I don't. I've been fighting these feelings for months, maybe even longer. And now that I know you feel it too." He trailed off, taking a step closer. "I don't know if I can stop." I turned away, staring out into the darkness of the yard. The moon was full, casting a pale light over everything, making the moment feel almost surreal. "What happens now?" asked, my voice small. I couldn't look at him. If I did, I knew I'd fall apart. He moved behind me, close enough that I could feel his body heat. He didn't touch me, but his presence was overwhelming. "That's up to you," he said quietly. "If you want me to leave, I will. But if you tell me to stay," he paused, and I could feel his hesitation, the raw vulnerability in his voice. "If you tell me to stay, I will." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the swirl of emotions that threatened to drown me. My entire life I had played by the rules, done what was expected of me. But this was different. It felt like stepping off a cliff, like letting go of everything I had ever known. And yet I wasn't afraid. Not with him. "Stay," I whispered. The word hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. It was an invitation, a surrender. It was me admitting that I wanted this just as much as he did. He let out a shaky breath, like he'd been holding it in, waiting for my answer. He turned me around to face him, his hands settling on my hips as he pulled me in close. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, looking up at him, my eyes wide and unguarded. I've never been more sure of anything. The relief in his eyes was palpable. He leaned down, capturing my lips in a kiss that was softer, more deliberate. It was the kiss of someone who knew exactly what they wanted, who wasn't holding back anymore. I felt his hands slide up my sides, leaving a trail of heat in their wake. I shivered, arching into his touch, wanting more, needing more. We moved together like we had done this 1,000 times before, like our bodies knew each other instinctively. He lifted me, and I wrapped my legs around his waist, feeling the strength of his arms as he held me up. He carried me inside, his lips never leaving mine, and I knew in that moment that there was no going back. We had crossed a line, and there was no undoing it. He laid me down on the couch, his body hovering over mine, his eyes searching my face as though he was afraid I'd change my mind. "Tell me if you want me to stop," he murmured, brushing a strand of hair away from my forehead. I reached up, pulling him down to me. "Don't stop," I breathed. "Please don't stop." The next few moments blurred together, a tangle of limbs and whispered words, the sound of our breathing filling the room. I felt like I was floating, like I was weightless in his arms. Every touch, every kiss sent a jolt of electricity through me, and I clung to him, afraid of losing this feeling. He was gentle, almost reverent, as though he couldn't believe this was real. He kissed me like he was trying to memorize every inch of my skin, his hands moving over me with a tenderness that brought tears to my eyes. I had never felt so wanted, so cherished. And then it was over, and we lay there together, tangled up in each other, our breaths mingling in the quiet. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. He held me close, his fingers tracing circles on my back. "What happens now?" I whispered, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He was silent for a long moment, his hand stilling on my back. "We figure it out," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Together." And in that moment I believed him.